The Bible, not just a book but a library of texts that shape civilizations. The Bible. The term Bible originates from the Greek word ta biblia, meaning the books. The word biblion itself translates to scroll, and eventually became the common term for book. The phrase ta biblia was used by Hellenistic Jews to refer to their sacred texts. Notably, the biblical scholar F. Bruce points out that John Chrysostom was the first to use this phrase to describe both the Old and New Testaments together in his homilies on Matthew, delivered between 386 and 388 CE. The Bible is the sacred scripture of both Judaism and Christianity, comprising a collection of writings considered divinely inspired and authoritative for faith and practice. Rather than being a single book, the Bible is a library of texts, laws, histories, poetry, prophecy, letters, and narratives that developed over many centuries. The process by which these writings were recognized as scripture is known as the formation of the biblical canon. The term canon, derived from the Greek canon meaning rule or measuring rod, refers to the official list of books accepted as sacred and normative by a religious community. The canon did not emerge suddenly or universally. It evolved gradually, influenced by historical events, theological debates, and the practical needs of Jewish and Christian communities. Understanding the formation of the canon provides insight into the origins of the Bible and the ways religious identity and authority were shaped throughout history. The books of the Bible were first written and copied by hand on papyrus scrolls, with no original manuscripts extant. As a result, establishing the exact period of the original composition is challenging and subject to discussion. The earliest sections may date to around c. 1200 BCE, while most of the New Testament was established by the 4th century CE. The Bible consists of texts in various literary forms, originally written in Hebrew, including some portions in Aramaic, and Koine Greek. The history of the Bible. The Bible is made up of 66 books, written over about 1,500 years by over 40 people from different backgrounds. The Old Testament, which forms the basis of Judaism, was finished in stages. Its last book, Malachi, was completed around 400 BCE. Scholars still discuss which texts belong to the first official list, called the canon. The move from oral stories to written books helped shape Jewish religion and identity. The New Testament, telling about Jesus and early Christians, was written between 50 and 100 CE, ending with Revelation around 90 CE. Deciding which writings were official took centuries, with church councils helping set the structure. Most of the Bible's current arrangement was set by the 4th century CE, but it wasn't widely available in English until the late Middle Ages. A limestone boulder, known as the Zayat stone, was discovered embedded in a stone wall in Tel Zayat, about 35 miles southwest of Jerusalem, in 2005. Believed to contain the earliest complete Hebrew alphabet yet found, the artifact dates to around 1000 BC. As Kyle McCarter of Johns Hopkins University explains, what was found was not a random scratching of 2 or 3 letters, it was the full alphabet. Everything about it says this is the ancestor of the Hebrew script. The existence of a standardized alphabet at this time suggests that literacy was more widespread than previously thought, making it plausible that multiple individuals contributed to biblical texts over centuries. While the discovery of the Zayat stone does not pinpoint when the Bible was written or compiled, it provides valuable insight into the language used in its composition. By tracing the development of this script and comparing it to biblical text, historians have discounted the single author theory, concluding that the Bible was written by multiple scribes throughout the first millennium BC. In addition to linguistic analysis, variations in writing style and vocabulary across different biblical books further support the idea of multiple authors. BC. The authors of these texts were prophets, apostles, monarchs, and others, representing a range of backgrounds and literary styles within the collection. For example, Moses is traditionally associated with the Pentateuch, David with various Psalms, and Paul with several letters in the New Testament. The content includes law, history, prophecy, poetry, and guidance on social and spiritual matters. Historical and archaeological corroboration. Excavations at Jericho. Archaeological work at Jericho has uncovered layers of city walls and evidence of ancient habitation. While these findings broadly align with the biblical narrative of a once fortified city, interpretations vary among archaeologists. Some question whether the timing and specifics of the ruins match the biblical account of the city's conquest, highlighting ongoing debates about chronology and cause of destruction. The Tel Dan Stele. This inscription from around the 9th century BC references the House of David, providing external confirmation that a dynasty bearing David's name existed in ancient Israel. However, it is important to note that some scholars debate the implications of this reference, questioning how directly it supports the biblical depiction of David and his lineage. The Moabite stone, Mesha Stele. The Moabite stone not only mentions names found in 2 Kings 3, but also describes events that parallel the biblical account, such as the conflict between Moab and Israel. This alignment reinforces the historical context and lends support to the reliability of the biblical narrative regarding interactions between these nations. Hittite records uncovered in Turkey. Archaeological discoveries of Hittite records confirm the existence of a major civilization frequently referenced throughout the Old Testament. These findings dispel earlier doubts about the Hittites being a mythical people and lend weight to the Old Testament's portrayal of their role and influence in ancient history. Archaeological discoveries help support the Bible's historical context and cultural details. Despite scholarly debate, accurate references to genealogy, places, and confirmed figures prompt many to see these findings as evidence of factual reporting in Scripture. The Merneptah Stele is an engraved stone inscription commissioned by Merneptah, the king of the 19th Egyptian dynasty, who ruled from around 1213 to 1203 BC. This stele contains the earliest clear reference to the entity Israel, mentioned in the context of the king's campaign to ancient Canaan. The best supporting evidence for the Bible's claim that the Israelites entered Canaan is Merneptah's stele, a carved granite monument created by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah at the end of the 13th century BC. Discovered in Thebes in 1896, the stele primarily details the Egyptians' victory over the Libyans and their allies. However, it is the final 3 lines of the inscription that have garnered the most interest among historians. Israel has been shorn, it declares. Its seed no longer exists. This statement boasts of the near destruction of this people by one of the ancient world's superpowers in their homeland of Canaan. Yet, the Israelites would survive. The story they would go on to tell about themselves and their relationship with their God would arguably surpass any of Merneptah's achievements. It would give rise to what is surely the most influential book of all time, the Bible. Merneptah's stele may describe more Jewish suffering at the hands of their perennial Egyptian oppressors, but it at least suggests that they were in Canaan during Merneptah's reign, 1213-1203 BC. The Dead Sea Scrolls. For a long time, the oldest known manuscripts of the Old Testament were copies from the 9th century AD. In 1947, several ancient leather manuscripts were found in jars in a cave at Qumran, north of the Dead Sea. These manuscripts date back to the 1st century BC and include complete versions of Old Testament books. Scholars have observed that there are minimal differences between these earlier texts and later versions, indicating a consistent copying process over time. Origin of the Hebrew Bible. The earliest section of the Hebrew Bible comprises the first 5 books, known as the Torah, teaching in Hebrew, and referred to as the Pentateuch, meaning 5 books, in Greek. The second oldest portion consists of narrative histories and prophecies, collectively termed Nevi'im. The third division, Ketuvim, encompasses Psalms, Proverbs, and additional historical narratives. The term Tanakh serves as an alternative designation for the Hebrew Bible, and is derived from the initial letters of its 3 primary sections, Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings. Documentation listing the contents of these three divisions first appears in the Babylonian Talmud around 550 BCE. There exist three principal historical versions of the Hebrew Bible: the Septuagint, the Masoretic text, and the Samaritan Pentateuch, which includes only the first 5 books. While these versions are interrelated, they do not share identical developmental trajectories. The Septuagint is a translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Koine Greek. This work began in Alexandria in the late 3rd century BCE, initiated by about 70 Hellenic Jewish scribes, and was completed by 132 BCE. The translation was likely commissioned by Ptolemy II Philadelphus, king of Egypt, to serve the needs of Greek-speaking Jews in the Greco-Roman diaspora. Complete copies of the Septuagint available today date from the 3rd to the 5th centuries CE, while earlier fragments date to the 2nd century BCE. Revision of the text began as early as the 1st century BCE. Fragments of the Septuagint were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in Qumran in 1947, with manuscripts dating from 250 BCE to 100 CE. Portions of the Septuagint are also preserved on papyrus from Egypt, dating to the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE and the 1st century CE. The Book of Daniel, composed during this period, was included in the Septuagint at a later stage, even though the text claims to have been written around 586 BCE. The Hebrew Bible is derived from the Masoretic text, specifically the Leningrad Codex, which dates to 1008 CE. Consequently, the Hebrew Bible is sometimes referred to as the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text represents a medieval version of the Tanakh, composed in both Hebrew and Aramaic, that serves as the authoritative text for the Hebrew Bible within modern Rabbinic Judaism. The Masoretes initiated the development of what ultimately became the definitive Hebrew and Aramaic versions of the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible in Rabbinic Judaism toward the end of the Talmudic period, circa 300–500 CE, though pinpointing an exact date is challenging. During the 6th and 7th centuries, 3 Jewish communities contributed distinct methods for recording the precise letter text, including its vocalization and accentuation, identified collectively as the Massorah, the origin of the term Masoretic. Early Masoretic scholars were primarily located in the Galilean cities of Tiberias and Jerusalem, as well as in Babylonia, modern Iraq. In ancient Galilee, particularly Tiberias, circa 750–950, scribes produced copies of the Hebrew Bible without a unified standard, unlike the Babylonian tradition. The canonical pronunciation system known as Tiberian Hebrew, and various annotations created by these scholars, sometimes diverged from the Babylonian custom. By the 9th century, these differences were reconciled, resulting in the establishment of the standardized Masoretic text. The Samaritan Pentateuch has been preserved by the Samaritan community since antiquity. Although European scholars only rediscovered it in the 17th century, its oldest surviving manuscripts date back to around 1100 CE. The Samaritans are an ancient ethno-religious group originating from the region of Samaria, distinguished by their unique religious traditions. The Samaritan Pentateuch consists solely of the Torah, which refers to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Unlike the broader Jewish tradition, which recognizes the full biblical canon known as the Tanakh, Samaritans regard only the Torah as divinely inspired and do not accept the other books included in the Jewish scriptures. While a Samaritan book of Joshua exists and is partly based on the Tanakh's book of Joshua, Samaritans consider it a secular historical chronicle rather than a canonical religious text. Structure. The Bible is divided into 2 main parts: the Old Testament and the New Testament. 1. Old Testament, Hebrew Bible. Also called Tanakh in Judaism. Purpose: records God's covenant with Israel, history, law, prophecy, wisdom, and poetry. Major divisions: A. Torah, Law, Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Covers creation, patriarchs, Exodus, and the giving of the law. B. Neviim, prophets. Former prophets: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. Latter prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets. Focuses on history, moral guidance, and prophetic warnings. C. Ketuvim, writings. Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles. Includes poetry, wisdom literature, historical accounts, and reflections on life and faith. 1. New Testament, Christian Scripture. Purpose: centers on the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the early Christian community. Major divisions: A. Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Narratives of Jesus' life and ministry. B. Acts of the Apostles, early church history and missionary work. C. Epistles, letters, Pauline epistles, e.g., Romans, Corinthians, Galatians. General epistles, e.g., James, Peter, John, Jude. Provide instruction, encouragement, and theological teaching. D. Apocalypse, Revelation. Apocalyptic vision of the end times and the ultimate triumph of God. Biblical canon surviving documents from the 4th century show that different councils within the church released lists to guide how various Christian texts should be treated. In this context, a canon refers to an official list of sacred books accepted as genuine and authoritative by the Christian community. The earliest known attempt to create such a canon, similar in scope to what would become the New Testament, was made in 2nd century Rome by Marcion, a Turkish businessman and church leader. Marcion's proposed canon included only the Gospel of Luke and the letters of Paul, reflecting his unique theological views. Disapproving of this selective approach, the Roman Church expelled Marcion, but his actions spurred further discussion about which writings should be considered scriptural. Following Marcion's expulsion, efforts to clarify the canon continued. In the later 2nd century, the Syrian writer Tatian sought to address the diversity of gospel accounts by creating the Diatessaron, an early attempt to combine the 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, into a single harmonious narrative. Building on earlier initiatives, the Muratorian canon emerged, believed to date to around 200 AD. This is the earliest known compilation of Christian texts resembling the New Testament as it is recognized today. It was not until the 5th century that all the different Christian churches came to a basic agreement on the biblical canon, with the books included reflecting not only the events they describe, but also the historical context in which they were accepted. Centuries later, during the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, reformers excluded certain books from the Old Testament, such as Judith and Maccabees, that were originally written in Greek rather than Hebrew. These excluded texts are known as the Apocrypha, and while omitted from most Protestant Bibles, are still included in the Catholic Bible. The Old Testament canon. The Old Testament canon developed gradually over many centuries. 1. Oral traditions to written texts. Before texts were written, Israelite history and laws were transmitted orally. Stories about Abraham, Moses, and David were preserved through communal memory. The transition from oral to written began around the monarchy period, 10th-6th centuries BCE. 1. Torah, Pentateuch. By the time of Ezra, 5th century BCE, the Torah was already considered authoritative. Ezra's public reading of the law in Nehemiah 8 illustrates its central role. The Torah became the foundation of Jewish identity, especially during and after the Babylonian exile. 1. Prophets and writings of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12, and writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, etc., were accepted gradually. Books like Esther, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. Eventually, Rabbinic Judaism solidified the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, with 24 books, roughly equivalent to the Protestant Old Testament. 1. The Septuagint, LXX, a Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures, produced in Alexandria around the 3rd-2nd century BCE, included additional books, Tobit, Judith, 1-2 Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach. These were widely used by Jews in the diaspora and later became foundational for the early church. The Old Testament is the first section of the Bible and covers events from the creation of earth through figures such as Noah and Moses, concluding with the exile of the Jewish people to Babylon. The Old Testament is closely related to the Hebrew Bible, which has roots in the ancient religion of Judaism. While the precise origins of Judaism are unclear, the earliest known mention of Israel appears in an Egyptian inscription from the 13th century BC. References to the Jewish god Yahweh can be traced to an inscription concerning the king of Moab from the 9th century BC, and it is hypothesized that Yahweh may have originated from the mountain deity Yu in ancient Seir or Edom. During the reign of Hezekiah of Judah in the 8th century BC, historians believe the compilation of what would become the Old Testament began, with royal scribes documenting historical events and narratives. In the 6th century BC, under King Josiah, the books of Deuteronomy and Judges were compiled and incorporated. The Hebrew Bible's final form emerged over the subsequent 2 centuries, following the annexation of Judah by the Persian Empire. The term Apocrypha refers to ancient Jewish writings that were not included in the official Hebrew Bible, also called the Hebrew Canon, the set of texts recognized as sacred and authoritative by mainstream Judaism. Most apocryphal books were composed during the Second Temple period, approximately 550 BCE to 70 CE, a time when the Second Jewish Temple stood in Jerusalem and Jewish literature flourished. These works originated in regions such as Israel, Syria, Egypt, or Persia, and were written in languages including Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The Apocrypha often explore biblical characters and themes, though their origins remain unclear. While an older theory suggested that an Alexandrian canon was accepted among Greek-speaking Jews in Alexandria, this idea is no longer supported by scholars. Evidence shows that apocryphal books were not included when the rest of the Hebrew canon was established. During New Testament times, the Apocrypha were read and referenced. Books like Tobit and Wisdom of Solomon serve as examples, but they are never directly quoted as scripture in the New Testament. In contemporary Judaism, none of the apocryphal books are considered authentic or canonical, and they are excluded from the Hebrew Bible. However, the Ethiopian Jewish community, sometimes called Falashas, maintains an expanded canon that includes several apocryphal works, such as Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, and Baruch. This overview provides context for the Apocrypha's complex history, languages, and reception, highlighting both their influence and their exclusion from most Jewish traditions. The Council of Nicaea, held in 325 CE, was a notable event in Christian history. One outcome of this council was the establishment of the biblical canon, a set of texts officially recognized as authoritative. Before the council, there was no universal agreement on which writings should be included in the Bible. Various communities maintained different collections of religious texts, often leading to discussion and disagreement about which ones ought to be considered inspired. The Council of Nicaea was called by Roman Emperor Constantine due to concerns over divisions within the Christian Church. Bishops from various regions of the Roman Empire met at the council to address theological and doctrinal questions, including determining the content of the biblical canon. Eventually, the council settled on a list of texts regarded as canonical. This included the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Acts of the Apostles, letters attributed to Paul, and other books considered authoritative by those present. New Testament. The New Testament originated in the 1st century CE with early Christian texts written in Koine Greek. These works, later named the New Testament, were distinguished from the Septuagint, the Greek version of Hebrew scriptures called the Old Testament. The New Testament survives in more manuscripts than any other ancient work, highlighting its historical importance and widespread transmission. The earliest Christian writings, arranged chronologically, are the letters of Paul, commonly referred to as the Epistles, which began circulating among churches around 50 AD, likely shortly before Paul's death. These letters were transcribed by scribes and widely disseminated, eventually being compiled into collections. As Paul's correspondence became increasingly influential, other early church members, motivated by his precedent, commenced writing and distributing their own letters. Scholarly discourse continues concerning the authorship of certain New Testament texts attributed to Paul. Many academics assert that some were composed by his followers or later emulators, indicating the shifting conventions of attribution within early Christianity. Although Paul's letters established a foundation for early Christian literature, oral traditions concurrently proliferated, sharing accounts of Jesus' life, teachings, and post-resurrection experiences. Notably, Paul's epistles convey a sense of immediacy in describing Jesus. Although Paul himself did not meet Jesus personally, knowing him solely through reported visions. The Gospels, narrative records of Jesus' life, were composed approximately 40 years after the earliest epistles and were not accessible during Paul's lifetime. The determination of which Gospels would be deemed canonical was a protracted process, necessitating considerable scholarly and ecclesiastical deliberation. Though consensus ultimately focused on the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this resolution was gradual and subject to ongoing disagreement. Early Christian communities frequently maintained divergent opinions regarding authoritative texts, with debates persisting well into the 2nd century. By then, the four Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, and 13 letters ascribed to Paul were commonly circulated, alongside additional works considered for inclusion. Around 200 AD, an initial consensus about the New Testament canon began to develop. Yet the definitive list was finalized only at church councils convened circa 400 AD. This era witnessed a transition from scrolls to codex books, facilitating more practical collection and preservation of texts. The eventual recognition of 27 books within the New Testament canon largely reflected long-standing Christian beliefs, but the process of official endorsement involved extensive discussion and negotiation among church authorities. The quantity of New Testament manuscripts is exceptional among ancient literary works. Thousands of manuscripts have survived, with the oldest fragments dating to approximately 130 AD, and the earliest complete copies originating from around 350 AD. In contrast, most ancient texts exist in relatively few manuscripts, generally copied centuries after their original creation. This remarkable level of preservation has enabled scholars to examine the textual history of the New Testament extensively, underscoring its significant and persistent influence on world history. Different canons across traditions. 1. Jewish canon, Tanakh, 24 books in Hebrew, finalized by 2nd century CE. 2. Catholic canon, 73 books, includes deuterocanonical texts, Tobit, Judith, Maccabees, etc. 3. Protestant canon, 66 books, following the Jewish Tanakh for the Old Testament. Martin Luther moved the Apocrypha to a separate section, calling them useful but not scripture. 4. Eastern Orthodox and Coptic canons include even more texts, such as 3 Maccabees, Psalm 151, and others. The books of the Catholic Bible were established as canon by the Council of Rome in 382, with additional confirmation at Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397. The canon was translated into Latin as the Vulgate between 385 and 405 CE. Subsequent ecumenical councils standardized the canon, and the Council of Trent, 1545-63, authorized the Vulgate in response to the Protestant Reformation. Over time, different biblical canons have emerged. Catholic Bibles include the deuterocanonical books, also known as the Apocrypha, in the Old Testament. Translations like the Neighbor and RSV CE keep these books, following the Latin Vulgate tradition for liturgical and historical reasons. Eastern Orthodox Bibles include deuterocanonical books, with some traditions adding unique Old Testament texts depending on the national church. English Orthodox editions, such as the Orthodox Study Bible, typically translate the Old Testament from the Greek Septuagint. The Ethiopian Bible, also referred to as the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church Bible, represents one of the oldest and most comprehensive biblical canons currently known. Its development is closely tied to Ethiopia's early Christian traditions, with its text composed in Ge'ez, an ancient Semitic language. Ge'ez is no longer a spoken language, yet it continues to serve as the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Ethiopian Bible is estimated to predate the King James Version by approximately 800 years, with certain manuscripts having been carbon dated to the earliest centuries of Christianity. The historical significance of this text is further highlighted by Ethiopia's enduring Christian heritage, which began in the 4th century when Christianity was established as the state religion. The Ethiopian Bible is notable for its extensive canon containing between 81 and 88 books, which is far more than the KJV. An expanded canon includes several texts not present in the KJV, such as the Book of Enoch, Book of Esdras, Book of Baruch, 3 books of Maccabee. The canon excludes several books found in the Ethiopian Bible and the Catholic Bible, such as the deuterocanonical books, like Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon. The Gnostic Gospels are a collection of early Christian writings, many discovered in 1945 at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, that reflect Gnostic beliefs, a movement emphasizing secret spiritual knowledge, gnosis in Greek, as the path to salvation. Examples of Gnostic Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, many resembling parables but without a narrative of his death or resurrection. The Gospel of Philip emphasizes mystical teachings about sacraments, marriage, and union with Christ. The Gospel of Truth presents a highly symbolic meditation on knowledge and salvation. The Gospel of Judas portrays Judas not as a traitor, but as the one disciple who truly understood Jesus' mission. Why they were not included in the canon. Lacked apostolic authority. Most were written in the 2nd–4th centuries, too late to be linked to the apostles. Contradicted core Christian teachings, denied the goodness of creation, the incarnation, or the bodily resurrection. Limited use. They were not widely read or used in Christian worship across the churches. Orthodox defense. Church fathers like Irenaeus, c. 180 CE, strongly opposed Gnostic texts, labeling them heretical. The earliest Bible translations. The oldest full Old Testament translation is the Greek Septuagint from the 3rd century BC. The first complete translation of both Testaments is the Latin Vulgate by Jerome in the 5th century AD. Septuagint, Greek. This Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible was made in the mid-3rd century BC for Greek-speaking Jews after Alexander the Great's conquests. It became the standard Old Testament for Christians in the Greek world and is still used in Eastern Orthodox liturgy. Vulgate, Latin. St. Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in the late 4th and early 5th centuries AD, using Hebrew texts for the Old Testament instead of the Septuagint, addressing the shift to Latin in the Western Roman Empire. First English translations. For centuries, only handwritten Latin Bibles existed, accessible to the educated. The invention of printing in the 15th century. Translations and versions show Septuagint scrolls, Latin Vulgate manuscripts, and printing presses. Animate timelines of translations. Wycliffe, Tyndale, King James. English Bible history depict Wycliffe, Tyndale, Henry VIII, and the King James Bible. Use dramatic reenactments and printing press visuals. Different canons use animated comparison chart. Jewish, 24 books. Protestant, 66. Catholic, 73. Orthodox, 81+. Gnostic Gospels illustrate Nag Hammadi texts, show Gospel of Thomas and Judas, and explain why they weren't included. The Hebrew Bible visualize Torah scrolls, prophets, psalms, and Jewish worship. Add animations for tonic divisions, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, canonization process, show councils, scribes writing, debates over which books to include, and animated canon lists. Archaeological evidence. Use images of Jericho ruins, Tel Dan stele, Moabite stone, Merneptah stele, and Zayat stone. Highlight how archaeology supports biblical history. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Dramatic cave visuals, parchment fragments, and scholarly comparison with later manuscripts. The Bible. More than a book. A story that continues to shape the world.